excited to be interviewing Robin Hanson, who doesn't really need much of an introduction, and as your Twitter bio says, let's skip the witty banter and talk deep cues. So let's get this started here. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is, what's your P-doom, but not only in the subset of what's your AI P-doom, but what's your P-doom based on all existential threats, including nuclear, bioweapons, let's say in the next 500 years? Rough estimate.
I think human extinction is unlikely, but maybe human stagnation is pretty likely.
Okay.
So I'm less worried about everybody dying than just our sort of locking in some, say, world government that limits innovation and prevents us from growing. That's lower. So I think that's a pretty high chance.
Okay, so you think there could be an event that would be a catalyst for some major societal change, as you're mentioning, that you would say that's pretty likely?
Right. So I'm worried about the Great Filter, for example, I talked about, but I actually think the most likely filter we would face is something that greatly stopped our growth and limited us to, stay on Earth in some limited way, rather opposed to, the vast growth we could possibly count.
Right, and so obviously this would be a very limiting factor for the human race, especially if you consider philosophies like long-termism, where getting into an interstellar future one day earlier could theoretically save trillions of lives in the long term. If you're thinking about long-termism in that sort of sense, having slower growth could actually kill billions or even trillions of people theoretically.
Well, it would prevent them from existing.
Yes.
But many people think
that's fair.
Preventing somebody from existing is no harm to them. So many people are fine with preventing a vast number of future people as long as the actual people like what's happening.
Okay. Yeah.
Unfortunately. So for example, I actually think it's quite plausible that our descendants will prohibit anybody from leaving our solar system. Because if anybody leaves our solar system and goes off to another system, then their descendants could change arbitrarily and get arbitrarily alien and weird, and then come back here and contest our control.
Right.
So many people like our having a world culture now that shares world values and norms and then collectively makes key decisions. And they think things like, nuclear weapons or inequality or global warming or whatever, that we make collective choices about those, and people love that about our world. And if anybody leaves, that ends. And so that's actually the risk in my mind, that people will so love sharing a world culture and sharing norms and, having a world where we all decide key things together and use social pressure to make those happen. People love that. And they might not be willing to give that up to allow our descendants to colonize a million galaxies.
Okay, yeah, so what you're saying here is, if we can define that in your sort of terms of X risk, it's not actually X risk, but if you're defining that as kind of a worst case scenario for the human, maybe not the worst case, but like the most likely tail case. If we're considering that as your sort of X risk here, so it seems like Futarchy, as this feedback is pretty bad.
It is.
It sounds okay out here, but yeah, your own voice and a delay.
All right. Yeah. It feels slightly better.
Yeah, it's not.
Not so good. Okay. Shit, pretty solid. Can you guys actually scoot your chairs back?
Which direction? Here, this way?
Towards the TV.
Okay.
Okay, so this seems like a pretty bad case, as we were talking about. And Futarchy, as an extremely powerful, rigorous decision-making tool, should theoretically there should be a lot of ways to be able to implement this to avoid these bad cases for humanity, like the ones we were describing.
Well, even most problems we have in the world today, we fundamentally have because we have ideas about how to fix them, but government won't implement those fixes. We have incompetent governance. So that means we just don't actually solve many problems that we might do if we could organize competent people together, because the governance is incompetent. So if we had competent governance, we could just solve many more problems that we could agree are problems. But there is this risk that we will agree on values that then we use Futarchy to, in fact, prevent anybody from leaving. If enough people agree that we value sharing a world culture and that we are afraid of anybody leaving, then that's actually pretty hard to prevent anybody from
Right.
leaving. But a competent governance might actually be up to the task of achieving that. So there is a risk of having the wrong values preventing outcome, even if you have very competent ways to achieve your value.
Okay, so that makes sense. So if the issue you're proposing is the voting on values piece of things, where people vote for what they hope for, what would be your kind of approach to designing a value that could be, let's say you could get to unilaterally decide what the value is, to use a futarchy system to bet on, to optimize for something that's not one of these tail risks. How would you go about designing some sort of value?
So I would like our world to have adaptive values, i.e. values that would win out in adaptive contests, so that being adaptive, they would grow and flourish and expand. I think a key risk is if we have maladaptive values, then those would lose out to more adaptive values. But if we somehow have a world government that locks in everything, then it'll be able to prevent competition and therefore have values that decay. So to answer your question, I actually think it would make sense to have a large region of the world pick as its value some sacred goal of a human accomplishment, like when do 1 million people live in space, or when do we achieve physical immortality, goals that would take several centuries to achieve and would not be achieved as fast if civilization collapses, but goals that we could feel a sacred emotional attachment to, such that we would be proud to sacrifice for them and ashamed to abandon them. If we did pick such goals for futarchy, then the mechanism would have to figure out how do we prevent collapse in order to achieve this as soon as possible. And then we would in fact prevent collapse, and then we would achieve these goals eventually. We would have to pick new goals once we achieve them, but unfortunately, if we just tried to pick the goal of let's just be adaptive, people aren't very attached to that, and they aren't really willing emotionally to commit to it, and they would just abandon it whenever it was inconvenient. But if they would pick one of these other goals, it seems like people are actually able to see those goals as sacred and therefore be able to hold on to them. So that's what I would suggest. When do 1 million people live in space? Set the earliest date for that to be the goal, and then a society organized around that as a goal would in fact prevent collapse if it had competent governance to achieve that goal, and then we wouldn't collapse, and we would eventually achieve that goal in some sort of growing adaptive economy, and then we'd have to pick another goal that also served that same function after that.
If you're not using a composite value, because a lot of futarchy proposals detail that people would vote on composite values, for example, 40% GDP, 20% unemployment, et cetera.
Well, I would have a composite value. That is, I would have put a big weight on the sacred goal, but not infinite weight, because otherwise people wouldn't go for that.
So my question is, how do you make sure that if you have a highly weighted sort of sacred goal, as you're describing, that isn't necessarily the most optimized for the best state for the nation or the society in its current state? How do you make sure these future sacred goals won't interfere with the society that's present? For example, if it was when will 1 million people live in space, if the country had to allocate to achieve the goal, if the futarchy market was, if we allocate 90% of our GDP to getting 1 million people to live in space by this time, and then that'll obviously pass because that's getting you to the goal faster, but then the country is left with 10% of their previous GDP. How do you make sure it's not creating extra harm in the process?
So it turns out recursion works here. So let's imagine like one set of goals is just practical, like people today live comfortably, get what they want. And there's this other long-term sacred goal. And we're going to think about a relative weighting of these two. So we might put 10-90, 90-10. We have a whole range of different weights we can put on these two. And now the question is, how far could we go in the direction of putting weight on the sacred goal before people today suffer too much and they just cancel the whole thing? That's an issue. Or if you put too little weight on the sacred goal, we just actually won't achieve it, right? So that's the key question. But what you can do is have futarchy conditional markets on for each weight we gave.
Right.
What's the chance we would actually achieve the sacred goal and then not collapse? You could use those sorts of prediction markets to actually tell you the consequences of the different goals you could pitch.
So essentially bet on values, bet on beliefs is kind of what you're saying.
Bet on the consequence of a value choice.
Right.
And then markets should be able to give you a distribution over its guesses of the consequence of any particular value choice. So you can use this then to pick value choices according to consequences.
What happens if there's a composite value where the two factors that are weighted directly conflict with each other? For example,
They're all there. The whole point is that they have to conflict, otherwise there'd be no point in having both of them in there with a relative weight.
okay, yeah,
But
I see. But
obviously on the margin, they're going to have to be conflict.
right, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Well, what do you think about how kind of like the fundamental flaw described by Dynamite, the internet blogger, kind of plays into this of how I think the title of his post was "Prediction Market Does Not Imply Causation," in which you're not necessarily optimizing for the prediction market that's most effectively going to reach the goal that you voted on, because other decisions are going to impact it in the process. Do you think that combinatorial market networks could potentially solve that issue, or do you think it's an issue at all? Would that be a concern of yours?
There's something called the decision selection bias, wherein traders making a decision are worried that they aren't making the decision, and somebody who's making the decision knows more than they do, and that can bias these prices. I think that's a real thing, and there are ways straightforwardly to deal with that problem. But otherwise, I in fact think conditional markets are in fact estimating the right causal connection. So I have some blog posts on that. In fact, yes, there's a difference between correlation and causation, but conditional prediction markets are doing the right causation structure, not just a correlation.
So, and why is that? Can you just give a brief overview?
I mean, this is standard decision theory, as you may know, says to estimate for each option your expected outcomes, and it says to do that in a simple conditional expectation way, but that turns out to actually be the right causal way too.
Okay, so you're saying that the market has to imply it because the market is the most accurate way of implying the cleanest path to whether this proposal, if passed, will get us closer to the goal or the value.
I'm just saying, in most decision situations, conditional expectations are giving you the right causal structure. There's not a conflict between the two.
Okay.
In principle, there are ways in which conditional expectations don't equal causal conditions, but those are rare cases.
Can you give an example of one of
Well,
those?
there's people who study causal decision theory and various logical decision theories have all these scenarios where some super smart person can predict your choices, and then there's a two-box problem. There's a problem with one. There's two boxes. Some smart person either put money in both of them or just one of them, and you have to choose whether you take both of them or one of them, but they decided not to put anything in the second box if you're going to take both boxes. And so because they're so good at predicting you, you're well advised just to take the one box. But in causal decision theory, you should take both boxes, but this is because there's a deviation between what makes sense in general and this particular weird structure of somebody being able to predict what you do. But that's like the decision selection bias, which produces a bias like that. But again, most decisions aren't that sort of thing. It's just not a problem.
So building on the question of which decision markets are more accurate than others, what do you think about kind of the cases we were talking about with these, when we were talking about the sacred goals? Do you think that those markets would be less calibrated or less accurate than markets for maybe like a standard United States government's proposal because there's fewer priors or base rates that can be formed?
I think longer term goals are just always going to be more challenging. So it'll be harder to estimate the consequences of current actions on long-term, parameters. But if that's what you want, then that's still what you should do. It can be dangerous to set as your optimization goal something that's really easy to measure in the short term if it's not what you actually want.
Right.
If what you want is a long-term outcome that's harder to measure, you should still probably set that as your outcome, even if that makes it harder for people to estimate it, i.e. they'll have more noise in their estimates, but still tie incentives to the outcomes you actually want.
Right. So in terms of the people who are betting on the decision markets having to make decisions on whether certain proposals passing will affect long-term outcomes. Obviously, we're saying it's more challenging, but what are some workarounds for how traders can form their
So
sort
think
of
about a
priors?
company, right? A company stock is based on the long-term revenue of the company over decades. And then you have some immediate decisions. Do we start this project this year? And you can make much easier estimates of if we start this project year, know how much it will cost this year, how much revenue we'll have this year. And then there are these other longer term consequences of the project that will be harder to estimate. So we often, in fact, estimate whether the project's a good idea based on the more easily evaluated short-term metrics of how much it will cost this year and how much revenue we'll get this year, even though we know there are these longer-term consequences. But when we find it much harder to estimate longer-term consequences, we often settle for the more easily short-term things we can see. But in a futarchy, people will be actually asking themselves about that trade-off. They will say, is it okay here to use short-term metrics to judge this, or do I think that's going to mislead in this case? And that's what you want. You want people, say, running a company to ask themselves whether they should dare use more local short-term metrics because they're easier to manage, or whether that'll go wrong in the longer term. But this is just all organizations and all people. Even you in your life, you might say, well, what classes should I take this year to get good grades? Or, how should I allocate my time this week in order to, across my different classes or something? But that, these will have consequences all through your life. You're trying to ask yourself whether using some short-term immediate heuristics will be okay at managing those long-term. And that's why you have to ask, well, what could be some of the hidden long-term effects of these short-term choices that might get in the way? So I might say, for example, make sure you have some fun. If you just optimize your next week to maximize your grades in the next week, you will sort of lose your motivation over time because yes, you'll get max grade each week, but then if you're not having fun, you will just lose the ability to care about this. So give yourself some time to enjoy something that you study. And if it's near your classes and you study something and you actually get energized and it's fun, it's worth spending a fair time doing that, even if you get lower grades. Like you have to understand what are the key trade-offs between easy to measure short-term things and longer-term things you care about. But giving futarchy long-term goals gives the traders the incentives to think about those things and trade them off well.
Do you think that the voters, so considering like an average voter in the United States, Brian Kaplan talks about the myth of the rational voter. How do you think that there's a bias for the average American voter to pick a short-term metric because it feels more immediate in their personal perception of the world around them rather than picking a long-term goal, even if that would be more rational for the country?
Futarchy is a way to have better, more competent governance given whatever goals you give it. So it doesn't at all solve the problem of making bad choices about values. Futarchy doesn't assure you of that, and whatever problems democracy has with it, they aren't solved. So I'm only solving one part of the problem, and the other problem remains. So yes, any society that picks bad goals, they will suffer from those bad goals. In the long run, what we might hope is some cultural selection process will punish these societies that pick non-adaptive goals and reward the other ones, but that can be a long, painful selection process that you and your friends could lose.
do you think that that if you're comparing like a representative democracy like in the United States to futarchy, do you think that voters who pick the wrong candidate in the representative democracy, so those candidates are going to go into office, right? They have some power. They can't single-handedly change the entire government on their own. To an extent, they can, especially if it's the president. But in a futarchy, if you're picking a goal and that goal is something absurd, and then your market is approving this proposal. Maybe it's a big proposal optimized for the goal, and so it can kind of cause like rogue proposals, don't you think? And then it could make the country more susceptible to kind of devastation.
Ordinary democracy, politicians adopt policies that make sense to voters, which then is a mixture of confused values and confused senses of what causes what. Like the concepts of which policies will have which effects are confused, and then the goals are confused. So futarchy takes away the problem of having confused sense about what works. Futarchy will quite reliably achieve whatever goals you give it, and that's an improvement over ordinary democracy where politicians adopt policies that voters think would work but don't. It doesn't fix the problem that voters might adopt bad values, but that's already a problem in existing democracy. So you're just fixing part of the problem and not the whole problem, but I still say that's an improvement.
So do you think that proposals to use futarchy rather than to approve direct policies to elect representatives to vote in a Congress?
Just to be clear, my slogan for futarchy is vote on values, bet on beliefs. You're still going to be voting for representatives under futarchy, and they will be passing bills that change the value factor.
I'm
so
suggesting,
we're not changing the fact that you have representatives.
Oh, no, I'm suggesting instead of, I'm suggesting a different mechanism. I'm saying that you can vote on the value, and then instead of betting on whether specific policies will optimize the value, you do futarchy markets on whether putting this specific person into the legislature of the country will optimize for the value, and then the person in the legislature is voting on the direct proposals, kind of like a representative futarchy. Do you think that wouldn't work?
So it sounds like you're proposing something different both from what I propose and what we usually have.
Well, I'm saying it's kind of an integration of the two, as we were talking about the mistakes of the
So I need to be clear what it is, because it sounds like you're inventing a new idea.
Okay.
So here you say we have some outcome measure, and then we vote on what representatives to elect, and then those representatives just do whatever the hell they want.
No, I'm saying you bet. So imagine like a normal futarchy, right? Except instead of betting, will implementing policy X improve the metric, our welfare metric? The market would be, will instating politician X as president improve the welfare metric? Okay.
Using futarchy to pick people to be in charge and then letting them do whatever the hell they want, right? Well, the question is how constrained, can futarchy find any people who are reliably do good policies, or is it just stuck, picking the best person who will do the least harm, but they still won't do very good? So I would not be very optimistic about that compared to futarchy, although it might work better than our status quo.
Okay. Yeah. And just one more thing I wanted to ask you about is, do you think that futarchy would potentially work better for funding allocation? So let's say there was an organization that was very concerned about AI X risk, right? And they have to decide, they have $10 million, they have to decide which projects, we have all these proposals, which ones we're going to fund. Do you think that if they were somehow able to pick a welfare metric, maybe like will the value of their token go up based on consensus of whether people think there's a high or low P-doom passing this proposal or this proposal, do you think that system would work for funding allocation, possibly even more than impact markets?
So a crypto firm called Butter did do this to decide which projects to be funded for particular crypto ecosystems. That is, particular crypto coin ecosystems had some budget to decide to approve particular projects, and they did pick them based on futarchy, conditional decision markets about estimating each project and its effect on this ecosystem. So that has happened.
Yeah.
And that does seem to work.
What do you think about that compared to using impact markets?
I mean, if you can have a measure of the impact of a particular project, then there's a number of ways to do it that are pretty equivalent. That is, you just pay in proportion to the outcome metric you have, right? That's just giving an incentive contract. Incentive contracts are fine. I don't think futarchy gives you a better way to do an incentive contract other than that the people doing the project don't have to take as much risk. So under an ordinary incentive contract, the people doing the project have to invest in that project with some other source of capital and wait to get paid until the outcome shows up. Whereas the futarchy puts the risk on the bettors betting on the outcome, but then the project just gets the money straight out. And so then the people running the project don't have to take as much risk.
Right, makes sense. Okay, and then I guess maybe lastly, what I was going to ask, and then we can open it up to some audience questions here, But what do you think? So in the talk earlier today, I don't know how many of you guys were there. It's called Futarchy, a status report. And what the guy who goes pseudonymously by Prophet, who's the head of MetaDAO, was mentioning is kind of the way that Futarchy could get implemented on a larger scale is kind of proving that the organizations that are running their companies with Futarchy are consistently, on average, generating more profit, are more successful overall, and then after that kind of becomes a standard for venture that can possibly scale to government. What do you think, my question there was, what do you think is kind of the middle step between getting from these experimental crypto projects into, this is the standard for venture capitals to venture capital firms to invest in companies? How do you think that adoption happens?
The simple way that many innovations spread is that you have small scale experiments that seem to be successful, and then people do larger and larger scale experiments that continues to be successful, and then eventually you get widespread adoption. So there's no particular cutoff along that path. You just slowly do bigger and bigger applications. Most innovation works that way, actually. That's how almost all the things you know about happened. They just spread, gradually among people who opportunistically saw, well, that seems to be working better. Let me try it over here. And so that could be the hope here. One warning, though, is that we have this example of poison pills. So we're pretty sure that poison pills are bad for investors, but pretty much all firms have them, including startup firms. So it just seems like founders just would like to have a poison pill, because a poison pill would prevents takeovers by hostile parties who benefit the investors by paying more for a company and managing it better, but then throw the current manager out. So apparently we do not actually adopt, we allow poison pills, even though that seems pretty clearly good for investors, and we've proved that pretty clearly, but we still haven't made that the common practice to allow takeovers. So that's a warning that you could, in fact, prove that it's very effective on small scales, and it still might not spread because, managers might coordinate to prevent it. So, so there's a hope here it could spread and prove itself, but that's not guaranteed.
All right, so I think, thank you, Robin. I think we'll open it up to audience questions now. We got 15 minutes. I think that's what they wanted me to, I think I said 15 minutes of audience questions.
Sure.
So let's open it up.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Were you guys working in Bhutan?
I'm not. I've never been to
I
Bhutan.
read it somewhere.
I don't know anything about Bhutan. Not me.
So I wanted to ask about your use on fertility. So,
Okay. Well, make this and ask me anything.
I was wondering what you thought on the heritability of fertility and what you thought that implied in terms of TFR. So if fertility is heritable, that means that if the environment stays roughly constant, that every succeeding generation, the genetic predisposition to fertility will rise over time.
Yeah.
And that perhaps that could prevent like a very bad fertility crash. Do you think that will actually happen, or do you think that some assumptions are wrong there?
So there are standard strong regions in biology to think that fertility is just typically not heritable in normal situations. And so you have to deviate pretty far from the normal situations for fertility to become heritable. The question is, how heritable is fertility? Is how heritable are the behaviors that produced fertility? And a key thing to understand about humans is that long ago, culture tamed DNA. That is, long ago, DNA drove our behavior. And when we invented cultural evolution in order to allow it to change behavior, it often had to fight against DNA. And when DNA was strong, it just couldn't change behavior. And in order to allow cultural evolution to work on a wider range of our behavior, culture had to induce DNA to change to be more pliable and do what culture said. So culture is this very fast, powerful evolutionary process, but it needed to change DNA to get us to be plastic to do what culture says. And that's why plausibly most behaviors related to fertility are cultural, not DNA. which is why it'll be hard for DNA selection to produce higher fertility. Now, you could have selection for culture to produce higher fertility, but now that goes into the mix of all the other factors causing cultural change. So we see, yes, all else equal, more fertile groups will, grow and their culture will grow, but we actually see large, strong other effects on fertility through culture. For example, most kids get their culture from school and friends and TV and not so much from their parents. So the fact that the parents had a high fertility culture doesn't necessarily mean the kids acquire much of it.
Robin, what do you make of the view that Chad Jones just laid out?
He laid out a whole bunch of views. So any particular
I
one?
was just about to say. He seems to be quite dead set on the idea of weakest links, bottlenecking the fast takeoff scenario of economic explosion.
Delaying, not bottlenecking.
Yes.
Delaying.
Until those bottlenecks are removed,
Right.
in which case there is no more. I mean, it seems like a frivolous.
Well, I asked one question, which was how well his model accounted for our past changes, and he said he hadn't worked on that. So that would be my biggest doubts. When I've looked at models, I've looked at the models that account well for our past changes, which aren't quite so bottlenecked, but I don't think it's crazy to think there'll be big bottlenecks like that. I'm just not very sure. That is, it seemed to me like his models were kind of at odds with past changes. Those past changes have been pretty big and, and he was thinking, but anyway, I'm not very sure. But I don't very much disagree with what he said. Yeah, I mean, I do think quite plausibly this current revolution will take a while to play out. So I mean, a robust thing that he's telling you that we just do know is that in the past, big technological innovations just took a lot longer than people thought to finally have effects on the economy. He says, 2 or 3 decades, that was consistent. So steam engines, electricity, personal computers, internet, all of those things, in fact, for several decades after their introduction, didn't seem to have much effect on overall growth rates. And the standard story is that they don't actually give you much payoff until you rearrange other parts of, production process and firms and everything in order to take advantage of them. So that standard story applied to AI says, just introducing AI to current production processes and organizations gives you limited wins. What you'll have to do is find ways to reorganize production and reorganize organizations to fit this new technology, and then you'll see big wins, but that takes a long time. And that's believable. Then there's the question of how big it'll be then, but the idea of several decades delay is completely plausible. And be warned, if your investment portfolio doesn't reflect that possibility, you should reconsider.
I listened to your earlier Futarchy talks at 3 p.m. or something. Could you summarize?
Well, I described what the concept was, which unfortunately we didn't really do here. So many of you may well be confused. Describe what it was and, when I was inspired by it and who's done, what sort of projects have happened. And then I actually gave most of my time to this guy, Prophet, who is running a company that has done roughly 100 decisions using Futarchy. And they have a number of other companies that they've been mainly using it the last few years to do funding for new crypto projects and funding sources. So basically, as you may know, a key problem in crypto is people raise money for some project, some team, and then the people who are running it just run away with the money, called rug pulling. And that's really been a huge problem in crypto. And Futarchy actually plausibly solves that problem because it says when you raise money, you put it in this pool run by the Futarchy markets, and then you'll have to get a proposal approved there to get some money out. And the markets do not approve just giving you money to run away with. And so, that's actually a nice benefit. But apparently crypto projects are just way down. So he's trying to move into non-crypto projects to get the same benefit. And we'll see how well that works. But that was the previous talk. MetaDAO. But again, they've been using Futarchy for 3 years now. And they've been, again, 100 decisions run run using Futarchy. Their constitution says that key decisions have to be run that way. And they've created a number of funds with $50 million of funding that are run by Futarchy, deciding how the money goes. So this idea I had 30 years ago finally is getting tested, and so I'm happy to see tests. But the top point is that a basic idea like this doesn't work unless you work out a bunch of details to fit to it. And the only way to do that is try lots of stuff. And so I'm happy that people are just trying lots of stuff. Each thing MetaDAO is trying, I'm not sure it's a good idea, but I don't need to approve. I just want to see lots of things tried. And then eventually, hopefully, we'll come onto a set of details that go with this general idea that gets some traction and that people like, and then that'll be the win. In the far back?
The question was, there's a critique of prediction markets that they don't really predict the highest impact events because you don't know the unknown unknowns. And so that. Okay, so the structure of a decision market is you have a set of options, and for each option, you estimate the outcomes. The second part of estimating outcomes includes all possible outcomes, including weird ones, including black swans. So, people trading there are in fact considering things they might not know and what's the chance of those. And so that is just including all of those effects. Which option, however, might well neglect options you didn't think of. So a key question about Futarchy is who proposes the options. And that's a key issue for the mechanism. So for example, with some companies at the moment, there's just, the CEO makes some proposals and then maybe the market can veto them, but the market isn't allowed to make new proposals. Or if outsiders make proposals, they're held to much higher standards, or they don't get paid much if they win. And so you're not really encouraging people to introduce things. But if you have an open competitive market for proposals where you say, every week we have an auction, and whoever wins the auction, their proposal is considered. And now if their proposal passes, they get some big payoff proportional to the value the market estimates. Now, this is an open competitive process, and we're letting anybody think of any black swan proposal and get paid for it. So, now we're limited by can you actually think of black swan proposals, but the mechanism's quite open to them. And if you say, oh, but people can't think of everything, I'll say, well, that's going to be true of any mechanism we had here, right? The mechanism can do as well as possible being open to proposals, which would be better than maybe when we're only open to the proposals that the management team thinks of, and then we only ever evaluate choices that they offer to us.